just 18 days out from two mass shootings that left dozens dead, one of them specifically targeting Hispanics. It's appallingly apparent just how little impact these slaughters have had on President Donald Trump. Today, the president is giving every indication that he's retreating on his promise of gun reform, while at the same time returning to his focus on policies that target Latinos. We will get to guns in a moment. But first, this morning, his administration announcing a new rule that would allow the U.S. to hold migrant families in detention indefinitely if they cross the border illegally. That would be the latest turn of the screw at the U.S.-Mexican border, where Trump's policies have also separated families, put babies in cages, and adults in woefully inadequate detention facilities, all justified by rhetoric from the president comparing Hispanic migration to an infestation. So again, less than 3 weeks after a mass shooting aimed directly at Latinos and arguably fueled by Trump's own words, we are back to the politics of cruelty and fear from this administration. We are also predictably back where we started on gun control, which is to say, nowhere. Led there by a president who now appears to be cravenly capitulating to the NRA. We learned as much from new reporting overnight about a phone call between Trump and the head of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre, in which the president told LaPierre that universal background checks are not, repeat, not on the table. That's despite Trump's public pledge, right after these most recent shootings to finally take decisive action, even if that meant breaking with the NRA.
Look, the NRA has over the years taken a very, very tough stance on everything, and I understand it. You know, it's a slippery slope. They think you approve one thing, and that leads to a lot of bad things. I don't agree with that. I think we can do meaningful, very meaningful background checks.
This, of course, is not the first time that Trump has made a promise on gun safety and then turned around and broken it. Just 2 weeks after the shooting in Parkland, Florida, the president declared that unlike other members of his party, the NRA wouldn't have any power over Donald J. Trump.
The reason I had lunch with the NRA on Sunday, I called them. I said, you got to come over. I said, fellas, we got to do something. And they do have great power. I agree with that. They have great power over you people. They have less power over me. I don't need it. What do I need?
What an incredible statement that would have been, if true. But now today, though he denied he made any promises to LaPierre, Trump also seriously muddied his stance on what gun reform means to him, echoing NRA talking points along the way.
Why shouldn't anyone who wants to buy a gun go through a background check? What's wrong with that?
Well, what we're doing is I want guns to be in the hands of people that are mentally stable. And those people, I want them to easily be able to get a gun. But people that are insane, people that are sick up here, I don't want them to be able to get a gun. And plainly, and I don't think I've changed positions at all, we're working on background checks. There are things we can do, but we already have very serious background checks. We have strong background checks. We can close up the gaps. We can do things that are very good and things that, frankly, gun owners want to have done.
Here to talk us through it all from the Washington Post, White House Bureau Chief Phil Rucker. And with me on set, former Democratic Congresswoman Donna Edwards, former Republican Congressman, now an independent, proudly so, David Jolly, and Maria Hinojosa, anchor and executive producer of NPR's Latino USA. Phil, I want to start with you because you're closest to the action. You heard the president there in that last piece of sound saying, I don't think I've changed my mind at all. I think pretty much everyone with eyes in their head see him as having changed his mind, or at least saying one thing and now doing another. Tell us what the real deal is here on where the president is on background checks at this hour.
Well, he has changed his mind, John, and the word out of the White House last night and continuing today is that he will not be supporting universal background checks, which is something that he indicated very strongly in the immediate aftermath of the El Paso and Dayton shootings that he would get behind. And that's simply because he's listening to the NRA and following what they're saying. We should keep in mind, you know, he talks about the NRA as if they're perhaps a branch of government or that they have a seat at the table in making policy in this country, and they don't. They're a lobbying group. It's a special interest group, the same kind of special interest groups that the president campaigned saying he wouldn't listen to, but they speak for so many members of Trump's political base that he is listening to them, and he's shaping his policy based on what the NRA leaders want. Now, this doesn't mean there may not be some form of gun ideas, proposals that come out of the administration when Congress gets back in September. They're certainly looking at the mental health piece, but there could potentially be some closure in some some loopholes regarding background checks. That's to be determined. But the idea that Trump is going to sort of follow his conviction and follow what a majority of the American people want, which is these universal background checks, is just not true anymore.
Phil, I'd like you to stop ever using the words Trump's conviction together in any conversation that you and I have, because I think we both know that there is no such thing. I will say that on this program yesterday, on the basis of no reporting and sheer gut instinct, I said that I thought Donald Trump was probably having a phone call yesterday with someone whose name rhymed with Wayne LaFierre. And then it turned out a couple hours later, he'd done exactly that. So just give us a sense on the basis of your actual reporting, as opposed to my gut instinct, what happened in that phone call last night between Trump and the head of the NRA?
Well, your gut instincts were right, John. He did have that phone call, but it's not the first conversation that they've had. I mean, the president's been talking to Wayne LaPierre in the 2 or 3 weeks now since those shootings, and increasingly becoming convinced of the NRA talking points, which are that, you know, you take a step like background checks and it becomes this slippery slope, and you end up, resulting in policies where you're taking guns away from people, which the president is, of course, afraid to do because of the political backlash there. And it's been clear that the president, at least early on, was open to background checks, and now is not, and that's because of the success that the NRA has had in lobbying him. But it's not just the NRA. There are also, NRA-aligned members of the administration who have had the president's ear, who've been making this case, making the political case to the president against any of these new gun restrictions.
Guys around this table, I got to say that when Trump first said after these shootings, when he said, background checks, we're going to do background checks this time, you saw a parade of friendlies, Trump friendlies, go on television and say, this time the president really means it. I'm going back to my comment about Trump not having any convictions. They say, oh, Trump really means it this time. He's going to lay down the law. He's laying down the marker. He's going to go against the NRA. I want to play one of them right now, because as I watched it happen, I thought, are you people idiots or what? Because if you had seen the way he bailed on the Parkland promises, if you had seen the way he speaks every year at the NRA convention and the things he says in that room, you knew that there was no way he was going to go against the NRA. But here's one of the people who went on television, one of the president's minions, and a guy who sometimes breaks with President Trump, but Chris Christie taking the bait, hook, line, and sinker just a couple weeks ago.
And let's talk about how the president's responded to the crisis in the last week. The way he's responded to has been to visit El Paso, to visit Dayton, and to call against the wishes of the NRA. A Republican president has called for universal background checks and a red flag law. Now, that's leadership too, Ram. And you can, listen, wait a second. You can say, and I have been critical, and I've been, Patrick, please. I've been critical of the president's rhetoric at times, as you know, sitting at this table. And I've been critical to him personally at times about his rhetoric. But this week, he has moved further than George W. Bush ever moved on this issue, than previous Republican presidents before George W. Bush ever moved on this issue. So if we're going to criticize the president at times, as we do at this table rightfully, then we need to give him credit this week for the fact that he's, in fact, trying to move the Republican Party in a different direction than it's been done before.
David Jolly, I ask you, we heard Chris Christie there say, leadership. We got to give him credit. He's moved the party further than it's ever moved on this issue, further than George W. Bush, further than a Republican president. He's going there. And now, today,
Chris Christie was lying when he said that. And all of Trump's apologists were lying, and they knew it. We're 3 years into this. Look, there are moments where politicians demonstrate that they're not just a bad leader, they're a bad person. And what I mean by that, what Donald Trump has done is he's put his own self-interest above the interests of the nation. The NRA has a very compelling control over Republicans for 3 reasons. One is the money. We always talk about the money. The other is the mobilization of voters. They are one of the most effective groups at mobilizing constituencies. Politicians respond to that as well. The third, though, is you can go back almost to the inflection point where Bush 41 left the NRA. And the NRA has successfully indoctrinated a generation of Republican leaders with this absolutist Second Amendment policy. Donald Trump shares none of that Second Amendment conviction. Otherwise, he wouldn't have come out and said yes to universal background checks, and now he pivoted. This is all about his own self-interest. And when I say there's a distinction between a bad leader and a bad person, we lost nearly 3,000 people in 9/11, and we marshaled every resource of our government for a whole-of-government response. In the wake of Katrina, Hurricane Maria, we marshal all of our government resources to respond. Health epidemics, marshal all of our resources. The last year, we have stats from the CDC. 2017, there were over 14,000 murders through the use of a firearm.
Yep.
There were 24,000 suicides through the use of a firearm. Simply by scale, this is a national epidemic that is killing Americans, and we have a president who took one phone call from somebody that controls his own fate in 2020, and Donald Trump chose himself over the safety of the country.
Donna, I ask you, is there any other way to read this? I mean, I look at poor Chris Christie there, and I say poor in quotes. You know, it's like Donald Trump is Lucy with the football. For anybody who wants to believe somehow that Donald Trump is going to suddenly have a conviction, have an ability to cross any of his political benefactors, anyone who represents his base, he is just Lucy put the football. They run at it, they kick at it, and then they fly up in the air and come crashing to the ground, as you see Chris Christie do today, if you look back at that tape. Should anybody ever, from this point, for this moment forward, whether Donald Trump's term now lasts for another 5.5 years or 5.25 years, or it goes for just another 1.25 years, should we ever believe a word that Donald Trump has to say on this topic ever again?
Well, that's an easy answer.
Yeah, I know.
No.
I'm teeing you up here.
I'll be honest with you. I never believed him at all when he said it. I mean, we heard what he said after meeting with the Parkland survivors. I mean, we've had children killed in elementary schools, in churches, on the streets. I mean, you name it. And this president doesn't change. And so it didn't surprise me that he flip, and then flopped again on the issue of guns. What I will say is that I have never seen another president who looks at an issue that's a 90% or 9 out of 10 people who believe that you should have universal background checks, and then just says, oh, no, the public's not ready for that. Most people would actually take that football and run with it, but not this president. He's not to be trusted. He's not to be believed, not from one day to the next, not from one moment to the next. And no surprise that Wayne LaPierre pulled his strings one more time.
Maria, you were in El Paso. It's fun, genuinely fun, to mock Chris Christie and the Chris Christies of the world who go out and carry Donald Trump's water and then have him spit it back in their face and make them look like fools. But it's not fun at all to anybody who lives in El Paso or is affected by this shooting, or in any other place where there's been a mass shooting, who maybe believed what Donald Trump said in the immediate aftermath, who maybe believed that he was actually finally going to cross this Rubicon. There's nothing fun about that, and it seems like an incredible 18 days later, just 18 days later, for the president to be essentially kicking those people while they are down and still hurting, as everybody does from these events, for many, many months thereafter, not just 18 days.
So the thing, John, is that Latinos and Latinas in the United States, we heard what he was saying when he came down that escalator in 2015. So the kicking has been going on since 2015. A lot of people have kind of just caught up when a 21-year-old takes an assault weapon and goes in and mows down people and says, I'm doing this because I hate Latinos, Hispanics, Mexicans, immigrants. Okay. But this has been going on for a very long time. So it is more salt on the wound. And again, it's very hard to talk about a kind of politicization of what just happened in El Paso with the people of El Paso who are coming to terms with the fact that they were targeted by this president kind of consistently. Right. You know, El Paso is like, hey, we just do our thing. We go to Juarez, we come back, we crisscross. And what's up with this president who's now taking it to criticize us? So they are in the trauma of realizing that a president of the United States of America and his words has led to 22 funerals in their city. So I don't think they believe anything at this point. They're processing the fact that the words of the president have ended up, and it's very hard to say this, it's horrible, but have ended up with the lives of 22 people taken. Right.
So Trump, like many people who are in the thrall of the gun lobby, adopts a certain kind of rhetoric which goes to the notion of mental illness, like the very easy, convenient thing of like, there are crazy people out there. We don't want crazy people to have guns. I think everyone agrees we don't want crazy people to have guns. We also, all of us who are sensible, recognize that there are crazy people in every country on earth, and there are nothing like the kind of gun death rates anywhere else in the developed world or the undeveloped world that there are in the United States. I want to listen. This is a classic NRA talking point that Trump has been consistent on. I want to hear, let's play this tape of Donald Trump talking about the scourge of mental illness and how that's the only problem that we have related to the gun crisis.
Mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun.
There's nobody more pro-Second Amendment than Donald Trump. But I don't want guns in the hands of a lunatic or a maniac. We don't want to see crazy people owning guns, but I also want to remember that mental illness
is something nobody wants to talk about. These are people that have to be in institutions for help. I'm not talking about as a form of a prison. I'm saying for help. And I think it's something we have to really look at, the whole concept of mental institutions. We're looking at mental institutions, which we used to have, like as an example, where I come from in New York, they closed up almost all of their mental institutions, or many of them, and those people just went onto the streets. And I have to tell you that it is a mental problem, and I've said it 100 times, it's not the gun that pulls the trigger, it's the person that pulls the trigger. These are sick people.
Phil Rucker, I ask you, this point is not a sophisticated point. The point that people who are in favor, the 90-some% of people in the country are in favor, at least some new gun safety, new gun control measures. It's not a sophisticated point to point out that, hey, you know what, like mental illness is a commonality across the entire world, and the only place where we have the kind of gun death is the United States. So when you point that out, or when other reporters, when you talk to people, not the president, because I'm sure he would ever address anything in quite such a logical manner, but when you talk to people at the White House about this point and how obviously not made up it is, but how convenient it is and what a talking point it is, what do you hear back from the people who are responsible for actually coming up with policy, to the extent there are policies in this White House?
Well, John, the point you just raised is a really important one, because mental illness is not a uniquely American problem, but gun violence seems to be. And when you talk in the White House or even to the president about it, I was at one of those gaggles over the weekend that you just played video from, they're fixated on this mental health point because it's been a priority for the NRA to shift the focus away from guns as a problem to mental health as a problem. But Trump is taking it even a step further, and he's talking about reopening mental institutions that were closed in the 50s and 60s and 70s because of their inhumane treatment of patients. Reopening these institutions, effectively locking up more people who are mentally ill. And there's a lot of concern when you talk to experts outside of the government, of course, but just experts in this field who say this kind of language from the president creates a stigma around mental health, makes you think, well, if you have a mental illness, you therefore could be a mass murderer. Right. Or if you have a mental illness, you also may have an AR-15 and planning to go, kill people somewhere. That's not what mental illness is necessarily, but this is a convenient way, I think, for the White House, and we're probably going to see some policy proposals about this to show that they're doing something in response to these shootings without actually doing anything to change the gun laws.
Right. So I want to go look. There's we were talking before about the victims in El Paso. There's victims now in a horrifically large number of communities around America that have been subject to mass shootings. We got the Parkland kids out. The Washington Post has a headline about the Parkland kids who have a new plan. Parkland students unveil sweeping gun control proposal and hope for a youth voting surge in 2020. You, Dave Jolly, were on the air on this show, I believe, the Monday after El Paso and Dayton, basically saying something that was sort of a clarion call, essentially saying the only way there's going to be gun control of any kind in America is to get rid of all the Republicans. Yeah. So, I don't want to just repeat that, but you see it in the context of what the Parkland kids are calling for. They are essentially singing your song, saying we need to have a surge in youth voting. We need to have a surge in voters who care about this issue, because we need political change, not on the issue, not like the existing construct is going to move because the issue moves them. It's got to be, we got to get rid of the impediments to the kind of change we need.
And those impediments are Republicans. I'll spare the nation the speech again, but you got to beat Republicans. You got to beat Republicans. And kudos to the Parkland kids for doing something that is truly a comprehensive proposal. I mean, it's got 8 or 10 elements to it. And frankly, it provides a blueprint for both chambers, for the House and the Senate, because the House is limited by its own political coalition, if you will, and the Parkland kids are putting this out there. The mental health thing, for just a moment, is such a critical debate that we have to reset with the president. It is not mental health challenges. It is not video games. It is not hate platforms. It's that people with mental health challenges, people who play violent video games, people who go in hate platforms, have instant access to firearms in the United States. The dispositive nexus we have to crush in the United States is the access to firearms by these communities, by these individuals. But I would also say this, and I would love to see a reporter press the president on this. Flip the script on the president. If it really is health care or mental health, you know what he's speaking to? the need for comprehensive background checks. Not just universal, not just every transaction, but the data that we pull on an individual when we do a background check. Let's do a mental health check on the individual. I'd love to see us do that.
But you know what? You also have to, like, I spent some time reporting on this issue of mental health and getting access to a gun. If you actually talk to men who are depressed, most men who are facing depression are not like, I can barely open my eyes and open the window, but let me go get an assault weapon and kill people. It's not the way mental health depression works. So the fact that he has taken an issue that has taken so long for our country to be able to talk about it, and he's transformed it into this, now we've got to take the other, anyone who suffers from a mental illness, and put them again, cage them off. It's just continuing this whole notion of if you're not perfect, we need to set you aside.
Well, this is why I think when Democrats come back next week after, they are going to put forward a really comprehensive package beyond just background checks.
Right.
And frankly, you shouldn't be able to go to a parking lot and buy a gun that you can't buy in a gun shop. And those are the kind of loopholes that we're talking about right now.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.